Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Woodpeckers Deep Dive. Today, we're going to take a look at Woodpeckers Saw Gauge 2.0. In a real-world test of this tool, we're going to set up my 1962 Sears Craftsman table saw. About 3 months ago, this was a big pile of rust. I've cleaned it, lubed it, replaced the bearings, put it all back together. Now it's time to get it aligned and get it ready to go to work. So let's take a look at why this is a critical alignment on your table saw. The blade needs to be parallel with the miter gauge slot. Let's say that they're not parallel and that the back of the blade is canted toward the left miter gauge slot. If you use a miter gauge in that slot as you come through, when the wood gets to the back side, the blade's going to be too close and it's going to burn. If it's canted the other way, let's say that it's angled toward the right miter gauge slot, now when you're using your rib fence, as you're pushing a board through, it's going to bind on the back of the blade. That can cause a number of problems. One, obviously it's going to burn, and two, it could kick back. So this is a matter of safety and accuracy both. We want to get this blade so that it's perfectly parallel to both of these miter gauge slots. So let's take a look at how Woodpeckers Saw Gauge 2.0, and as far as that goes, the original saw gauge, set up to run in the miter gauge slot. It's really a very, very unique design. In fact, it's patented. These miter gauge slots are all over the place. The standard is 3/4 by 3/8 deep, but some people make it 750 and then make the bar smaller to fit. Other people take a 750 bar, then make the slot fit. So there's quite a bit of variance within the different manufacturers of how wide that slot is. On top of that, there's also variation within one slot. This could be several thousandths difference from one end to the other. So Rich Hummel, the president of Woodpeckers, came up with this idea many years ago, and that is, how do you keep something perfectly centered in this slot all the time? And you do that by triangulation. We're going to take 2 polished pins and put them in the bottom of the slot. Then we're going to take a larger pin and drop it on top of that. Now, it doesn't matter how big that slot is or whether it varies from one end to the other, the center of this pin is always going to be in the exact center of that slot. Now, I said the standard is 3/8 by 3/4, but the miter gauge slots are all over the place, and it still doesn't matter with this setup. This is an old combination machine from Europe, and the slot on it is metric and really very thin and very shallow, but our alignment pin setup works exactly the same way. So with the pin set up, now we're ready to put the cradle on, and we're just going to drop that V-block right over our pins, and now we've got that located. Now we want to adjust that so that there's about half of the travel of our dial indicator travels a full inch, and we've got more than half of an inch left of travel. Now we're going to take a look at it here, and we're going to adjust the 0 point at the front of the saw blade. Okay. Now I'm going to move to the back of the saw blade, and you can see that it went from 0 to 18. Okay, so that means that my saw blade is canted to the right. I need to adjust this so that the saw blade is further away from the left miter slot. So we made our adjustments. Now this is going to depend a little bit on what type of saw you have. With this old Craftsman, the trunnion is bolted to the underside of the table, so it doesn't have anything to do with the motor, the outside case. We're just loosening the bolts that hold the trunnion to the underside of the table and adjusting that. On unisaws and some of the other bigger cabinet saws, the top will be independent of the arbor and it will be attached to the base. You'll loosen the 4 bolts or 6 bolts that attach the top to the base and adjust your top. But either way, whether you're adjusting the trunnion or the top, you're getting them so that we get this set up right here. So when we're at the front of the blade, we're at 0. If I don't move the blade and slide this to the back, we're going to see a difference of about 0.02 of an inch. Now, what we also have to think about is run out in the blade itself. And I know mine has a little bit. So let's try this again. We're going to go back to the front where it says 0. I'm going to take a marker and put a little dot right by my pointer. Then I'm going to bring that to the back, rotate the blade around until I get to my point, and we'll see that we are spot on 0. So, regardless of the blade run out, I know that my blade is perfectly parallel with my miter gauge slots. That's just what we were shooting for. So the procedure that I just showed you for aligning the saw blade to the miter gauge slot could have been done either with our original saw gauge or saw gauge 2.0. The difference in our new version is that we now have the ability to extend the arm and move our dial indicator further away, over closer to our rib fence. That's what we're going to do now and work on checking the alignment of our rib fence. So we're going to slide that in and tighten down those 2 Allen screws. And now we have a lot of travel to our bar. In fact, this comes with 2 of those extender bars. Now, the traditional way to align the rib fence to the table is simply to eyeball it to the edge of your miter gauge slot. So you bring it up close, lock it, and you should see exactly the same exposure all the way along. This looks really good, but you know, there's some things that could go wrong here on a fairly small level. Our miter gauge slot could be worn. Hey, it's a 52-year-old saw. That's bound to have a little bit of wear on that groove. The fence might not be perfectly straight, so let's not rely on that. Let's actually get in here with the dial indicator and check this out. All right, so to do that, we're going to drop our blade. I'm going to bring the fence to a sort of average position here. Lock it up. We're going to slide the dial indicator across. Compress it about half of its travel. Lock the beam. And make sure everything's in correct alignment, and then we're going to set our 0 point. Now we're going to slide this to the back of the table. And we're going to see that it moved about 15 thousandths, and it moved closer. Okay, you can see I'm changing that direction to see which way it's going, and it's going so that it's tight this way. So my rib fence is about 15 thousandths towed in, which is exactly what you don't want. Toe in is not good at all. If anything, we wouldn't mind being about 5 thou towed out. So every brand of saw is going to be just a little bit different. On this old Craftsman, there are 4 bolts that lock the fence down. I'm going to loosen 3 of them pretty good, and 1 I'm just barely going to crack. So after we adjusted our fence, we're going to bring it on. We're going to lock it, Set our 0 point at the front of the saw. Now we'll slide this to the back, and we can see that we're spot on, right on parallel. So, our rib fence is parallel to the miter gauge slots. Our blade is parallel to the miter gauge slot. Our table saw is dialed in and ready to make accurate cuts. Now here's another application for the saw gauge that you may not have considered. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Woodpeckers coping sled on the router table, and we talked about the fact that with that coping sled, it really doesn't matter whether this fence is parallel to the table or not. In fact, for 90% of the work you do on a router table, this angle just doesn't matter. Okay? It's all about how much of the bit is exposed beyond the face of the fence. But when you're using the miter gauge slot, it's critical that the miter gauge slot and the fence are parallel with each other. So we're going to drop this in and find our 0 point. We'll just bring it up there, drop the cradle down on our pins, adjust this to 0, and we'll slide this to the other end, right in front of the clamp. We can see that we're off by about 10 thousandths. So we're going to lean that out, clamp it down. Now it always moves back just a little bit, so we're going to split the difference on that. There we go. Got our fence perfectly parallel from one end to the other. Hey folks, thanks for watching Deep Dive. Hope you enjoyed our talk about Woodpeckers Saw Gauge 2.0. If you're looking for a great way to get dialed in accuracy in your machinery setups, this is the tool for it. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you'll always know every time we're coming out with another deep dive or any of our other great videos. See you next time. Thanks.